Hello and welcome to ArenaNet Craft Corner. It's not really a thing, I just made it up, but maybe it'll catch on. Anyway, my name is Josh Foreman and I'm the coordinator for the Living World release Origins of Madness. Now, this content prominently features some pretty terrifying creatures, such as this one for example. Now, I know what you're thinking is, when you see something like that, the first thought is, how can I put that into my mouth? And so that's what I'm going to help you with today. We are going to be making giant decapitated jungle gummy worm heads. I know, it sounds too good to be true, but it's true. It's a simple 4-step process, so let's check out the materials we're going to need. Alright, so this is what we're going to need for the first 3 steps. Now the very first thing we're going to do is make a sculpture of this worm. So to do that, we're going to use some polymer clay, some epoxy, resin, that kind of fun stuff. After that, we're going to make a mold of that sculpture. To do that, we need a food-safe urethane. When we have the mold, we're going to cook all these delicious ingredients together to make the gummy that we pour into the mold. Alright, well, let's get started. Now before you start any sculpture, it's super important to have reference. So I've got my model sheet here, and looking at it, there's one thing I can see is going to save me a lot of time, and that's the segmented nature of the worm. It has 6 identical sides, so if I sculpt 1/6 of it, and then mold that, cast that in resin 6 times, I'll save myself a ton of time. Now we're going to start out with this polymer clay called Super Sculpty Firm. You could use any kind of polymer clay. I like this because it holds detail better. And I'm going to make one segment of a segment. Just watch me here. Okay, so I've sculpted this segment of a segment. I've baked it in the oven according to the directions on the box. Now I'm going to make a mold out of it using this amazing mold putty. This is stuff that you can get at pretty much any craft store. It's just a 2-part mix. You mix it together and press it over your sculpture. I'm breaking the clay up into little balls and then pushing that into the mold to make the duplicates. I'm using a rubber stamp I made by creating a texture on a flat piece of clay, then pressing the rubber mold putty into it. Now I'll do the same thing with the head. I make one piece, mold it, and duplicate it 6 times. Now I'm going back and making some of the wrinkles more defined so the pattern's not as homogeneous. After sculpting lines in the clay, you can use rubbing alcohol on a brush to smooth it out. Now I'll make a mold for these pieces with urethane, and I'm going to get into detail about that process when I mold the whole sculpture. I'm mixing resin here to fill these molds to make the 6 copies I need. Now I'm putting all the pieces together. See, if you can roll snakes, you can totally sculpt this. I'm using epoxy clay to fill in the gaps. Epoxy clay is neat. It's a 2-part thing. You mix it together and it sets up in a couple hours. After getting all the pieces in place, I chopped it up so I can give it some bends. Now I'm putting it back together with more epoxy clay. Now I've got to make the entrails. This is going to take some guts. Get it? Okay, so I baked the Sculpey, and now I'm reinforcing it with epoxy clay and adding a few more details. I made a set of spikes and duplicated them in resin like I did the other parts, and now I'm laying them out on a flat surface to mold them all at once. There you have it, you've got your worm. Don't worry if it doesn't look exactly like this one. Being gummy makes things 100 times better. Okay, so we've got 3 elements here. We've got all the teeth and spikes all laid out there. We've got the entrails, which are on this kind of funny rig. I'll explain that in a minute. And of course, the main body of the worm. So this is where things start to get interesting. It's going to require kind of a complicated mold. However, don't worry, I've got a really good plan to level you up to the skills required. So we're going to use a very simple mold for these guys, then a little more complicated 2-part mold for this, and once you're comfortable with that stuff, then you're ready to graduate to what's going to be required for this guy, which I'm thinking is going to be a 4-part matrix mold with a 2-part mother mold. Don't worry, I will walk you through it step by step. Let's start with the simple one, shall we? For 1-part mold like this, you just make sure your sculpture is secured to a flat, non-porous surface, and then you're going to build walls around it. I'm using these wooden shims with some hot glue. You could use anything you have on hand, Legos or cardboard or clay. Oh, another thing I'm going to do, I made this little miniature worm. So I'm going to put this on the board as well with the spikes, and you can see how to do a very simplified version. You know, if you want to activate infantile mode, this is the worm you would make. I'm hot gluing the cracks to make sure there's no leaks. Okay, before we start mixing our rubber, the very first thing you want to do is remove any fancy jewelry you might have and cover up any clothes that you don't want ruined. I recommend using your John Marston cosplay cowboy shirt. I assume you have one of those. So you mix your rubber according to the directions. Kind I have here is a 50-50 mix. It's the easiest kind. Pour your rubber from up high in a tiny little strand, and that'll help break most of the bubbles. Alright, when it's all set up, tear the walls away. Remove the bits and bobs, then scrub the mold with a new unused toothbrush and dish soap. And rinse it thoroughly. Alright, now that you know how to make a one-part mold, it's time to move on to the two-part mold. We're going to be doing our entrails 2 parts. So, if we did it like we did the claws and stuff, right, it would have detail on one side, but the other side would be flat. And these are round and they have detail on both sides. So to do that, we're going to put them on a bed of clay that goes halfway up, and then we're going to pour rubber on that, flip it over, remove the clay, pour rubber on the other side. So let's get started. We've got this box, so you want to, sometimes it helps if you have a box on hand to sculpt your sculpture to fit the box. That's a nice way to do it. Or you could also build a box out of cardboard or whatever you have on hand. And then this is the clay we're going to use. This is called clean clay. It's an oil-based clay, which means it doesn't dry out in the air. And we're going to lay it down inside the box, put the entrails on top of that, and go from there. So let's cut this box down to size. Okay, once you have it cut down, put in a bed of clay. Once you have your sculpture embedded in the clay, take a tool and dig a little trench around the edges. This is called a mold key, and this will help the 2 halves of the mold fit together perfectly. Most of these mold making materials I got from smoothon.com. Alright, once that second half is set, you can tear away the walls. Okay, now that you have all that practice making molds, I'm confident you'll be able to handle your final challenge, making the worm mold. So, here's what I'm using. This is kind of optional, but I have this little spinning device here so that I can make a platform for my worm. And I can access it at all angles that way, easily. So, what's different about this one than our previous 2 molds is that we're going to be making a mother mold. A mother mold is basically a hard shell that's going to surround the rubber and keep it compressed nice and tight all the way around. Because this is so large and heavy, without that, when you pour the gel in there, it would probably squeeze out and leak through the seams. So let's get started. Step 1, we're going to cover most of the worm with foil. Okay, so I put foil around most of it, not around the edges where the seam is going to be. But basically that's just going to protect it from all the clay that I'm going to be packing around it. Now this clay is going to eventually be replaced by rubber, but for now we're just going to build a layer around it about 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick. Okay, so now we've got the entire sculpture encased in the clean clay, and the next step is going to be to use more clean clay to put around the edges, because we're going to dump a lot of plaster over the top of it. To help support that clay, I'm using these wooden shims to kind of build bridges around the sculpture. There we go. So basically what I did was I built a little moat around the outside of it, and what we're going to do is we're going to take some plaster and mix it nice and thick, and we're going to pour a mound over it essentially, and that'll be 1/2 of the mother mold. There you go. You can see it's pretty thick. You just start globbing it on. Okay, now your plaster is going to warm up as it sets, and after it's completely cooled and dried, it's time to flip it over and do the other side. Okay, when you're preparing the other side for the second half of the mother mold, the very most important thing you want to look out for are undercuts. You want to make sure that there's no place where the next coating of plaster is going to seep under there and lock tight, so that you want to be able to separate them. So if you see like little bubbles here that rise to the surface of the plaster, just rub some of the clean clay over that and smooth it out. Then when you're done with that, take some petroleum jelly, apply a thick coat over the plaster, and we'll be ready to pour the next one. Alright, so now we're going to take the clay off, most of the clay. I'm going to leave a little bit on this side here because there's going to be a fourth part. I'll get to that. And then you use a flat tip screwdriver to break the pieces apart. Oh, sorry, you don't want to break them apart. You want to gently pry them apart. Alright, so while prying the mother mold off here, look what I did there. I did it on purpose to show you what to do if it goes wrong. As you can see, it broke, and you can see the reason here is there's this very thin area, so I just wasn't generous enough with the plaster. So no big deal. We'll fix that. We'll just get rid of the areas that broke off, put another coat over, make sure that it's much thicker in those areas. Now that the mother mold's done, it's time to start working on the urethane rubber mold that's going to sit inside of it. So to do that, we're going to cut away the clean clay that's sitting on the exposed part of the worm, except for the top and bottom, and we're going to set that clay aside We want to make sure to keep it all together. That way we can measure that and tell how much urethane is going to fill up the cavity that's left by the clay. Now I'm making sure the sides are firmly together with large rubber bands and sealing the edges with clean clay so no urethane leaks out. Alright, we're ready for our first cook. So this is how it can go down. One of two ways. You could do it the normal way, the way any rational human would approach this situation, which is you put your mold together, you cook your gummy, you pour it in, you've got a beautiful giant gummy worm. Or you could do what I'm going to do, which is, it's kind of like activating tribulation mode for cooking gummy worms. I want to make it look as close to the game art as possible, which means I'm going to need 3 different colors. So I'm going to cook 3 different batches. It's terrifying. I'm going to be spattering crazy sticky colors everywhere, burning myself. I might fall into a pit of invisible spikes. There's just no telling what's going to happen. But if you're brave enough, follow along. If not, just do it the normal way. It's totally cool. No judgment. Okay, so this recipe could not be any simpler. All you need is 3 ingredients: water, unflavored gelatin, flavored gelatin. You mix them together in these ratios. Now, depending on how big your worm is, it's going to be a different amount of all these things. So you're going to have to use all of the maths to figure out how much you're going to need. Okay, so we measure our ingredients out. Now in my case, I'm doing 2 different small batches at once because I'm doing the 2 different accent colors, the yellow and the green. So we measure them out, pour the water into the pan. You want it to be cold water. Then mix your flavored and your unflavored together and sift that into the water. I'm going to give it a little bit of a stir and then just let it sit for about 5 minutes to soak in. And while these are soaking, I'm going to take my funnels and I'm going to put cheesecloth over them. The reasons we do that is because the jello gets the skim over it that we want to filter out. So I actually use some duct tape and just tape the cheesecloth over the mouth like that. Keep a close eye on it, stir it every minute or 2. And while that's heating up, it's time to, prepare our entrails mold. Now if you remember, these guts are in a 2-part mold, and we gotta keep it closed. Now it's best to keep it as tight as possible, so I use a bunch of rubber bands. I have an assortment here. Just want to make sure there's good pressure around the edges. To really seal the deal, it's best to put like some blocks of wood or something around it. I couldn't find any of the right size, so the next best thing is classical literature. I find the best books to use are The Scarlet Letter and Ben-Hur. So it needs to heat for about 7 to 10 minutes. When it gets really liquidy and starts to get the aforementioned skim on top, that's when you know it's about ready. I'm going to take some of this yellow and I'm going to set it aside to cool off a bit. This is going to be the yellow that's going to be inside the mouth of the worm. So if I poured it in right now, it would be so hot it would just fall down into the tips there, and I want it to stay up. So I'm going to let this cool off for a couple minutes. Now the guts, they kind of have this mix of green and yellow, so I'm going to pour a little bit of green, then a little yellow, and kind of back and forth to get that mix. Now the other thing I want to do with these colors is make the spines and the teeth and stuff. So I'm going to pour some of this green, because the spines are supposed to be like a dark brown or black. So I'm going to mix in some food color to darken it. Generally, if you want to darken colors, you mix in their complementary colors. That'll make them turn brown and muddy. I'm going to take a knife and just drizzle this over the mold. And then take the flat end of your knife and spread it down so it gets into all the little cracks and crevices. As you can see, I'm really not worried about it dripping out of the mold. That's completely to be expected. Okay, let's see how this yellow is going to work now. Use a craft stick to kind of push it around, keep it from getting built up at the tips. Alright, with that preparation work done, I'm going to clear this stuff out of the way and get ready for the main pour. Now for this one to make a brown color, I'm going to basically mix orange, about 95% orange, and 5% its complementary color, blue, and that'll give me a nice brownish color. While that's soaking, there's two things that I'm doing. First, I'm picking off the little excess strings of gummy that I don't want around the edges of the mold. And I put cheesecloth over this other container because I'm going to strain the gummy through this and through that, and then again out there, so it gets triple strained. I love to strain. So I'm setting aside some of this in a smaller container so that I can pour it onto the inside of the mold. The idea behind that is I'm going to create a thin skin of jelly so that when I pour the main batch in, it doesn't have a bunch of bubbles on the surface. And when you do this, you really have to come to peace with the fact that you are going to get drips all over the place. It's not a big deal, they're easy to clean up, you just wait for it to dry and then peel them off. Okay, after these have dried for a little bit, again you want to remove the excess from the edges. You don't want it filling in where the mold comes together, or that can make it leak. And once that's done, it's time to put the mold together and pour the final material in. Okay, we fill that to the rim. Then we take the plug part, stick it in. Actually fill it so that it overflows a bit when I press that on. That makes sure it gets up into the very tip. Oh, and let's not forget our infantile mode worm, the very easiest worm to make. Alright, let's see what we got here. Alright, before we go any further, stop and remember the golden rule of food preparation. Touch other people's food the same amount that you want your food touched by them. Listen to that. It even sounds delicious. This stuff around here, this is called flashing. And you just tear that right off. Oh, let's not forget our little one-piece mold version. So like I said, you can make this any size you want. Isn't he cute? So cute. Now to put these spikes in, what you do, well, I always start with the mouth. Take a sharp knife, and you basically cut little slits where the teeth are going to go. And you take them, spread that open, and stick them in. A toothpick is helpful to get them firmly embedded. And there you have it, a delicious and nutritious 3.5 pound snack. Don't forget, you can make it in any colors you like. Now it's time for step 4, serving and eating. Now, while it may be obvious that this would be a very romantic Valentine's Day gift, it's much more versatile than that. Imagine making it for your next birthday party, wedding, bar mitzvahs, doctor appointments, quinceañeras, jury duty. Well, thanks for watching and happy chewing. So much chewing.